All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to this edition of Noisy Reality on February 3rd. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Laura K.Field. Now, Professor Fields has done a intellectual history of Trumpism, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. It's published by Princeton University Press. She's part of the Illiberalism project at George Washington. What's that all about, Laura?
Liberalism studies program. It's part of the GW George Eliot, excuse me, the George Eliot School at GW, the Foreign Service School, basically. Studies illiberalism around the world. It was previously focused mainly on Europe, but I'm sort of filling in some of the American gaps there for them.
Got you, got you. Now, before I start, I wanted to get into some of the background. Many years ago, when Alan Brinkley had been denied tenure at Harvard, he came down to New York and taught a class at the CUNY Graduate Center before he wound up at Columbia, which was on the 60s. And in the class, what was quite interesting in the class was that everybody was interested. They wanted to do papers on the Weatherman. They wanted to do papers on the Black Panther Party. They wanted to do papers on the Young Lords Party. They wanted to do papers on the women's movement, etc. But when we got to the question of, well, what about conservatism? What about the fact that we had the George Wallace movement? What about the fact that Ronald Reagan got elected as president in 1980? People were not willing to deal with that issue. And a few years later, Allen wrote a very interesting article in the American Historical Review, which was a big critique of that. And he
Mm.
quoted, of course, Lionel Trilling had a famous comment in 1950 where he basically said, "There's no more conservatives in America. We don't have to worry about that." And then a few years later, his colleague at Columbia, Richard Hofstadter, essentially analyzed conservatism along the lines of it's a paranoid reaction. He was basically reacting to the Goldwater uh, race of 1964. Uh, and we fast forward through that time to people just not willing to understand mass movements can be based on conservatism in the United States. And of course, what always amazes me is that people ignored the history of our own society. That is the reaction to the Civil War, the reaction to Reconstruction, the reaction to the phenomenon of the KKK in the period after 1877 or after actually 1865 and then after birth of a nation. So when people talk about the immigration law of 1924, it's done on the basis of the resuscitation of the KKK. And we get to the questions before the Second World War, American First Movement, all these other movements. So it's not like we have not had these kind of situations in our society before. Uh, but what's interesting and unique about the contribution that Professor Field makes is she's looking at the intellectual history of the past recent phenomena we've been dealing with since 2016. So before we get going, I want to ask you, Professor Field, if you could talk to us about how you feel these ideas are being operationalized right now. We're in the middle of seeing Trump arguing for nationalizing voting. He wants to issue an executive order on voter ID, ending mail-in ballots. He's talking about, expanding the seizure of rolls in the United States beyond what he just did in Fulton County. So the ideas that you look at, because we're going to get into depth on this with you and talking about this, how is all this expressing these ideas that you have studied and analyzed in this?
Mhm. I mean, in the broadest sense, I think that the book can help us understand the difference between the first Trump administration and the second, and in that we're seeing so much that's so much more dramatic and effective in a way in the second administration, with going from going from Doge, right, and the deconstruction of the administrative state that didn't really happen in the first administration, but is now in all kinds of agencies being, closed down and people fired and the DOJ being wrecked. Um, so from there to the immigration policy, right? It's much more aggressive, obviously, and so what we're seeing with ICE stems, I think, pretty directly from a lot of the people I'm writing about, where they're really putting into effect things that Trump wasn't able to do during the first administration. And the election, the messing with the elections, that does have a precedent. They did try to do that in obviously on January 6th in 2021, and a lot of the ideologues I write about were big drivers of that. You know, the MAGA is very big, and I'm focused very much on sort of the intellectual slice of it. But they've been involved in really some of these big initiatives from Project 2025 to I think the things on the horizons. They're some of the fanatics and ideologues who are really fueling some of that and giving a kind of intellectual structure to it.
And how has the immigration issue been seen in the intellectual ideas that you've been looking at in this book?
Well, that's really a cornerstone of their thinking, and it draws on a lot of the populist traditions that you sort of gestured towards at the beginning here, from Goldwater to Buchanan in the 90s. There's kind of I mean, I think that a good formulation that maybe I'll just put on the table while we get started here is to contrast the ideology of Trumpism to the Reagan establishment, right? The movement sort of built up as partly as a response to the left supremacy in the intellectual spheres. There was this sort of movement of fusionism in the second part of the last century that coalesced around a trifecta of policies that we refer to as Reaganist fusionism, which is free market economics, social conservatism, and anti-communism abroad, or kind of a liberal internationalism, or adventurism if you prefer. The new Trumpism, or what I call the MAGA New Right, stands for, and this is a definition that came about. Michael Anton defined Trumpism in this way in
Tell us who
2016.
Michael Anton is.
Michael Anton is sort of this renegade, early vanguard defender of Trump, but from an intellectual perspective, he's got this background in political philosophy, and is associated with the Claremont Institute. And he wrote this piece in 2016 called "The Flight 93 Election" that people are probably a little bit familiar with, perhaps by now. So there's but he in that piece, which was basically a big attack on the establishment Republicans for not having conserved anything and for letting the country fall apart and for allowing immigration and all this stuff. But he did offer a definition of Trumpism, right? He said Trumpism stands for uh, nationalist economics, secure borders, and America First foreign policy. And I think there's still packed in there a whole lot of social conservatism, but you can see how that's very different from the Reagan stool of fusionism. We talk about the three pillars of Reaganism, and this is very different. And I think a big part of that is a more closed international, foreign policy. And Michael Anton has also just he is responsible for this new national security strategy that was just published in the fall. That was pretty controversial. So he's been very influential, and so it's a closed approach to international relations, and basically the secure borders and great replacement theory was a big part of what Michael Anton was worried about. I mean, he was basically saying the Democrats are allowing all these people to be imported into the country so that they can win elections. That's how he thinks about politics. So it's pretty unhinged, but these are the people that have been filling some of the intellectual spaces. And I think in the book I try to show how they have gradually taken over the institutions of the GOP, even after January 6th. So they coalesced and formed a movement during the first administration, but then they really consolidated their power under the Biden administration.
Now you're saying that Michael Anton was he one of the primary, was he the writer of the national security strategy?
That's my understanding. Yeah, he's the primary author.
Because they just
Yeah.
issued a revision of it about a week ago.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah,
I
which
have a
is
copy
sort of,
right here.
yeah, the revision is quite interesting. It's more subtle in terms of its approach to China. It's sort of realpolitik, if you will, towards China. So that first document you cited, it's so I would imagine that Anton would have been part of a team, but I could be wrong. Now the
Yeah,
other
I'm sure he was part of a team, but they do say that he's the primary, or
interesting.
that's what my understanding is. I
Interesting.
could be wrong.
Now, the other thing I wanted, before we get into the weeds on some of these ideas, is this whole issue of Nazism and fascism. Um, you talk about Nick Fuentes as sort of the undergird, so I guess he's sort of down there. If I think of Hamlet, he's like the old mole down there crawling with a ghost or something like that. But nevertheless, you had in October, Politico had that story about I Love Hitler. And
Hmm.
Fuentes was the subject of basically a debate back and forth at TPUSA, where
Hmm.
they were attacking him, defending him, John Stuart Millsing him. And you had someone like Tucker Carlson bring on Fuentes, and you had him also bring on a quote historian who was normalizing Hitler. And I'm just wondering, what do you make of all that? How are we supposed to process this kowtowing or mollycoddling of essentially Holocaust denial and Hitler?
I think what we've seen over the course of the last decade or so is a pretty calibrated welcome of a lot of fringe components and extremists into the GOP. And it was quite deliberate. It was it was, you can look at these moments where various figures were invited to or not invited to conferences, and you could kind of see what the old GOP is held up a little bit by a myth that says that they kept all of the white supremacists and anti-Semites out, right? That Bill Buckley built this perfect wall against some of these figures. And that's a little bit of a myth, but there's also some truth to it, right? There's certainly plenty of people who were very angry at Bill Buckley for what they thought is an overly sort of censorious approach. And now we can see that really that is all gone. And so Tucker Carlson inviting Fuentes on is one of these incredible moments where you just see those old barriers breaking down. And others like Peter Brimelow, he's another white supremacist who was recently invited onto Tucker Carlson's show. And so in the book, I chronicle some of these moments where the National Conservative movement uh, brought on had some extreme people in their audience, in there as speakers. And people like Darren Beattie is a great example. He's somebody who was fired from the first Trump administration because he had been speaking at basically a conference for white supremacists. And what that was discovered, and he was fired by the first Trump administration. Now he's back in state working for them again, and hosting meetings with the German far right parties. So it's a real problem. It was deliberate. There are some rifts that we've seen emerging now over the last few months over anti-Semitism and at the Heritage Foundation, which again has been quite radicalized. And now they're sort of paying a price for it, and yet they're sort of walking this fine line where they know they need to have the support of this radicalized base that they have in part created, while at the same time having to play nice in Washington with their donors and so forth. But it's very tricky for them, and they've faced a huge exodus of staff and some resignations from their board. But they seem to be betting on the MAGA sort of radical version of themselves being the one that's going to last. So, and JD Vance is in exactly that
Yeah.
same
Well,
pickle,
JD
what to
Vance
do.
going to the Munich Security Conference and basically telling everybody, "You guys got to go along with Auf Deutschland." It was quite a remarkable speech.
Exactly.
Um, but let's get into some of the intellectual stuff, and that is Leo Strauss. Now, Leo Strauss to me always fascinates me because here's somebody who was associated with Martin Heidegger, Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt becomes a jurist in the Third Reich, and who has been resuscitated in intellectual right circles in recent years. And someone like Leo Strauss, I know you were trained in Straussian philosophy, political philosophy, but
Hmm.
explain his break on the Enlightenment, because that to me seems a very interesting. What happens when Strauss decides to re-examine the Enlightenment and then reject it?
Well, I mean, I do want to be careful here, and it's not because I'm sort of devoted to Straussianism or loyal to it in any like really thick way, but I think Leo Strauss he's a German emigre, right, Jew that ended up in the United States during Weimar and was obviously very troubled about sort of the disintegration of society and everything that had happened in the middle, in Germany.
Hmm.
And so he is trying to identify, I think, causes of this. Again, he's a classicist by training and a sort of political philosopher. He wrote these long commentaries on ancient texts and the ways, he's understandings or the history of Western civilization, if you were, right, from the beginning. So looking at the biblical sources, looking at ancient Greek sources, and then trying to understand how these things have unfolded throughout history. So he's a pretty subtle thinker, and I think he shared with someone like Nietzsche's concern that with the death of God or the death of ideals, right, and transcendent political truths that everybody could agree with, that you would have a kind of nihilism emerging, and sort of with the rise of relativism and materialism, a disintegration of the moral core of society that keeps people sort of keeps political civilizations bound together in some sort of decent civil order. So so he is looking at this moment in his own time in history and seeing, okay, what has gone wrong in 20th century Europe and the world. And I think that he's a very subtle writer, but he builds up this dichotomy of the ancient world and the modern world. And so embedded in that is a critique of the Enlightenment, right? And the critique of this sort of or unmooring that happened with the Enlightenment, and this idea being that um, it was an invitation, all of that questioning of the old orders and of the religious orders and all of those transcendental truths, that invited a kind of relativism into the world, and then that decayed into you know, Nazism and Marxism. So that's sort of one version of the story he tells, but I think that it's a much more complicated picture. But that's basically the simplest version of one way of seeing this history that can get oversimplified. And I think what we're seeing with a lot of the people now is that they're taking that sort of questioning of the Enlightenment and saying, no, that's actually where things went wrong. We actually have to turn back the clock. Leo
Right.
Strauss, just, I mean, he's a careful thinker who wrote in, I mean, he's known for the sort of subtlety of his writing um, and his own way of understanding these complex thinkers. And so I would say he's still very questioning and open about some, where he actually lands on the Enlightenment, but a lot of the people who follow him are not so much, and they
Yes.
really do embrace this kind of anti-modern. Sorry, that was long-winded, but
No, no,
there's
no,
a kind
no,
of
no, no. That,
anti-modernism
yeah.
that is bound. A lot of these conservative reactionaries now certainly glom onto Strauss's, the simple version of Strauss, and that's also there embedded in a lot of other reactionary thinkers besides Strauss.
Yeah, no, I was initially a classicist, so I'm amused
Okay,
at
yeah,
watching
yeah,
all this. And, I would never teach with the Republic and dehistoricize it. I mean, to me, that's
right,
ridiculous. And or
yeah,
even Socrates, and I guess I was really turned on by the pre-Socratics, of course, that completely
yeah,
would annihilate all these ridiculous assumptions these guys make. But
totally.
yeah, but anyway, I wanted to intellectually sort of get Strauss into the picture. And then you have, I attended a conference once years ago where they had this the whole morning was devoted to Hayek. And the
Mm,
issue of Hayek writing The Road to Serfdom was basically, it was, hey, the owner of Reader's Digest decided to serialize this because he saw this great critique of the New Deal state in this
mm,
book. And this, of course,
mm-hmm,
becomes very important in conservatism. But let's get into these different schools you talk about.
mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm.
and because again, I've been involved in politics. I've been involved in, I was also trained in political science, not in political theory and IR and American politics. And I've been involved in campaigns. I've worked on Capitol Hill. So I
Okay.
have a more operationalized sense about how this works.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and political theory is interesting to me, but then when the rubber meets the road, I always look at what the road is like. Um,
mm-hmm.
so the Claremont School, who are these guys? How did they get started?
So the Claremont people are people like Michael Anton and John Eastman, who wrote the coup memos, right? These legal guy.
They go
And
just some people may not remember good old John
okay,
from
so John
2021.
Eastman, he's a constitutional law person who wrote the memos trying to explain to Pence why he had the authority to not confirm the election results on January 6th in 2021. So it was a pretty elaborate two-part, memo about all of the reasons why the election was perhaps fraudulent or might, that there were these other slates of electors and so forth. So, and he spoke at the rally at the Capitol that day with Giuliani, and so pretty far gone person. And I mean, it was subsequently investigated and disbarred, but he was a big part of the January 6th committee report. He's mentioned hundreds of times in
Right.
there, and people really call him out for none of it had any merit, really. I mean, so John Eastman is a Claremont guy, and the Claremont Review of Books was where that Flight 93 essay was published. And the Claremont Institute is a think tank on the West Coast. It's kind of a culture warring think tank. It's not very wonky at all, right? It's about mentoring young people and teaching them some of the traditions of the American founding and providing these conservative summer camp institutions that happen in various parts of the country, and by very different kinds of institutions. But they run one where it's a sort of formative experience for young conservatives, and then they have fellowships for people who want to pursue writing careers or social media careers in the conservative ecosystem. So, but their mission is to restore the principles of the American founding, and they were inspired by a student of Leo Strauss's named Harry Jaffa, who was a Lincoln scholar,
Yes.
and so an interesting figure, really cantankerous individual. But they've taken some of the way, Jaffa had sort of a hagiographic understanding of the founding, right? They really, this great man theory of the American founders and the American Constitution as the best possible regime. And so it was a very sort of highfalutin way of understanding and the American founding that also didn't, and then also a very rigid way of understanding the American founding, such that any sort of departure from that original perfect vision, even whether it be the New Deal or the Civil Rights Act, was seen as a kind of corruption, or at least by the heirs of Jaffa, the current people at the Claremont Institute. There's, I think, a kind of corruption that's happened, and they've also turned quite nativist, and that's in quite stark contrast to Harry Jaffa, who had a more egalitarian way of understanding the principles of the founding.
Now, Jaffa is
So
interesting because Jaffa, decided to write a book about the Lincoln Douglas debates, and then also that was interesting to me because having
very interesting.
actually, I remember many years ago, C-SPAN had all the debates on as a service to the public, which was quite hilarious. You can imagine that went on for days, and he, I guess, fancied himself as an expert on the Civil War. But what also I find interesting is their rather rigid understanding of the whole process of creating the Constitution. And then they freeze it in time and then ignore everything that happens afterward and during the process of actually establishing it. The fact that Washington and
Mm,
Jefferson and Madison had very different concepts than they do.
mm,
That they argue, and the argument. It's just that there's you get into the crux of how they've been interpreting that and weaponizing it in our body politic now for decades. Uh, so
yeah.
the other aspect of this you have is the post-liberals. Now, who are those guys?
So the post-liberals are a group of conservative Catholics who have got a pretty radical critique of liberal democracy, per se. So it's not just that the American founders were, that we've lost track of what they stood for. It's that rather this whole project of liberal modernity is toxic from the start, or corrupt, because it's based on an individualist anthropology, is how they speak of it. So it's kind of a critique of liberalism, but not in the sense of like liberals versus conservatives, but in terms of the Bill of Rights, right? And these more foundational principles that undergird the founding. And so they say, well, liberal modernity is based on an individualizing perspective, and that ends up corroding our communities, our families, um, our sort of subsidiary institutions, civic institutions. It's kind of Tocquevillian, right? You need these intermediary institutions, and the attachment to individual rights and so forth in liberal democracy have a corrosive effect on all of that. And so they instead want to reorient the state towards the common good. And sometimes it gets very theological, where they're actually resisting the Catholic Church's settlement with religious freedom and individual freedom. So some of these guys are pretty radical, sort of quietly opposing established church doctrine and arguing for a reintegration of church and state, by which instead of where the Claremont guys want to destroy the administrative state and sort of tear it all down, these guys want to seize the levers of power and reorient the whole apparatus of state. They're much more comfortable with executive power and with the administrative state, but their argument is we need to take charge of those institutions and use them to further our own ends, that the principles of government, which they call the common good, sort of the purpose of the telos of government, is to reestablish the common good, which generally tends to boil down to kind of Catholic social teaching and a sort of revised moral order.
Interesting. So, and this is how does this idea of integralism explain that to our audience? What does these are the folks that argue for integralism?
Yeah, so the post-liberals, as I said, they tend to be Catholic. Not all post-liberals are integralists, but I'd say all integralists are post-liberals. And the integralist is the more extreme. Um, the word integralist means the is what they're talking about there is the reintegration of church and state. Okay, so the idea is that the church should naturally be dictating what the state does, and the state needs to be directed towards the more sort of holy ends like spiritual salvation, the common good, but the state should be subsumed under the church and spiritual ends.
Now, how the
I mean,
national
I could go into all of the details. There's this guy, there's a Cistercian monk in Austria that Adrian Vermeule at Harvard and Gladden Papin, who's now in Hungary, they've all been kind of
well, tell
working
tell us
together
who
to for
Tell us who Vermeil is and
so
tell us
he's the
who
Adrian Vermeule is a legal scholar at Harvard, very well respected, and an expert on the administrative state and on executive authority and a defender of those things. And he's just very well regarded. But he's a recent Catholic convert, and he's joined up with these pretty radical Catholic actors to argue for Catholic integralism against a liberalism that he's at some points calls satanic. And he's also a fan of Carl Schmitt, who we've referenced already. Um, and so he's a very complicated, probably the most brilliant thinker on the new right, and I mean, sort of a pleasure to read because he's very lucid and it's very compelling, but it's also just very radical. And so he's part of this integralist movement. He's written a book called Common Good Constitutionalism, which is effectively a defense of a new kind of conservatism that would stand against originalism and have a much more fulsome moral dimension where the state is empowered to basically impose its moral outlook on the country, which he says is the objective truth about morality that we
interesting.
can know.
Now you have another category before we get into the fun stuff further, the national conservative category. Who are those guys?
Mhm. So I think just to get an orientation here, all of these different groups, we can think they are somewhat overlapping. They share an affection for someone like Viktor Orban. I think of it as like networked clusters of thinkers. And so there's the Claremont crowd, which is kind of different from the post-liberal Catholic crowd, but then the National Conservatives is basically the umbrella organizing group, more politically active, that they host the conferences and where the politicians and some of these scholars and more wonky types get together and discuss things. The head there is Yoram Hazony, is the main organizer for national conservatism, and he's an Israeli American who wrote a book in 2018 called The Virtue of Nationalism. And that book was an effort to just defend the concept of nationalism as opposed to patriotism, sort of full-fledged capital N nationalism. And his in his view, a healthy, robust politics, to have that, you need a robust, pretty homogenous nation state. And that means the people need to have a shared history, shared religion, shared language. And he says not necessarily shared ethnicity, but it kind of can easily tip into that. And so that's the shared principle, is this unifying, homogenizing nation state that they hold up as the ideal. And obviously has a pretty difficult. It's a difficult thing to fit in with American history.
Yeah,
It,
no.
you know.
Now the culture wars have been going on for, I mean, I would argue been accelerated since the 1960s. I mean, I would argue
Mm,
we've been in a emotional cultural civil war ever since the mid to late 60s, and it hasn't
mm,
stopped. It's morphed. And
mm-hmm,
you get the creation of these other think tanks like AEI, Heritage, later in the picture,
mm-hmm,
which then exert a even greater policy dimension in terms of the Reagan administration, Bush 1, Bush 2, and certainly Trump. But how do you see those kind of entities in this picture? And how do you see Project 2025 in this whole picture?
Well, so national conservatism sort of started to take formation during the first administration. And then a lot of the big think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, they were really still outsiders. It's
Outside,
weirdos
okay.
trying to put something together. And some of these big institutions, even the Heritage Foundation is the best example of they sort of kept their distance from Trump. Their leadership was not pro-Trump. They helped staff the administration. They certainly cooperated in some ways. I'm sure they provided some policy stuff. But the leadership, it was Kay Cole James who was the president of the Heritage Foundation during that first administration or most of it. And then she had written an essay about some of the legitimacy of the George Floyd protests, for example. And then the second, I think it was the second in command named Kim Holmes Jr., he had written against nationalism as a concept that could unify the country. So there was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of pushback. They were ousted in 2021, and that's when Kevin Roberts came in. And Kevin Roberts had been very much part of this building movement, working with the Claremont institution and those folks. And so he got brought in, and that was a real sign we're going to go MAGA. And that was after January 6th, so that was later in 2021, where the MAGA movement still had had growing power, even though Trump wasn't necessarily still going to be on the scene. So other institutions in DC, like the Cato Institute, didn't go that way. The Libertarian Party went very Trumpy. So it's a little, it's complicated. AEI has been pretty sort of above the fray, certainly has not gone MAGA. And so there are divisions here in Washington D.C. and in these institutions, but you do have the Claremont Institute sort of leading the charge. You've got the national conservatives, and when Kevin became the president of the Heritage Foundation, he also then went to the next NatCon conference and said, "We are coming over to you. You've seen the light, so have we. You've been the leaders here. We're going to follow you now, and we're all sort of in this MAGA world now together." So you had a pretty dramatic transformation of the configuration of the halls of power, I think, in DC under the Biden administration.
Now let's talk about how they weaponized certain issues. I remember maybe, 1978, 79, I'm reading about critical legal theory. And then I start seeing
Mm-hmm.
these articles about critical race theory, and I said, oh, this is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I sort of put it aside. I've met Kimberly Crenshaw, they look on
Mm-hmm.
big boogie persons of all this. Lovely woman.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you see this weaponized as this, my God, CRT. So
Yeah.
again, how does because you have in that, the national conservative elements there, you have people like Christopher Rufo, who's
Yeah.
quite an interesting character, but you have these guys who are, intellectual activists who want to put their policies into action. So tell us how you see the CRT issue, the DEI issue, how that blends into this whole melange, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's very, in some ways, it's just very ugly stuff because what they're doing is very explicitly and deliberately manipulating reality, and they're very explicit about how they're gonna, we've all seen the articles where Christopher Rufo basically says, I am going to use this word or this concept of CRT as as a tool of propaganda, right? To basically be a catch-all phrase that we can leverage and we can put it into basically the life stream of the discourse and make it so and shape things such that whenever anyone hears the word CRT, they think about all these other things they hate, right? And so it's a very sort of deliberate and clever manipulation of language that really had very, very limited foundation in reality. As you know, I mean, CRT is a real thing. It's been influential. It matters in academia. But they acted like this had been sort of that anytime somebody taught about Martin Luther King Jr. in an elementary school, that was critical race theory, which is absolutely perverse. And so but there was a very deliberate project of weaponization. And so they're very good at that. It was a very effective campaign, right? Suddenly, a lot of people were really worried about the books in their libraries, and I think what was happening is there was this growing wave of the Great Awakening and awareness about police brutality and and sort of these inequalities in how Black people are treated, or people of color are treated in the justice system. And as I think people were really waking up to some of those historical injustices, and this was in part a backlash against that. And then you had the George Floyd protests and some of the violence there, and they took that as a real opportunity not to investigate the causes of these historical problems or the complexities of any of that, but rather to foment a backlash and to excuse their own continual radicalization. So if you look at some of these speeches they were giving at the National Conservative Conference in 2022, the Yoram Hazony, the leader, said something like, well, we've experienced a revolution in America. Everything's changed now because of the woke neo-Marxists. And that's when he plants his flag basically for Christian nationalism. And he says, Christian nationalism, or the Christian religion, is the only thing strong enough to counter the religion of woke neo-Marxism. And so it becomes this huge culture war thing on the right that's sort of utterly absurd and in total bad faith. But I think with some people like Yoram Hazony, I think some of them fell for some of those lies that Rufo was telling. I'm not really sure how to make sense of some of these people and how they so fully buy into it, even though they should know better.
Yeah, and one thing you raise in there is this whole now, again, those of us who've examined fascism and the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany in the interwar period, there was this issue of homoeroticism that
Mm,
occurs, and the worship of the male body, the worship of the Superman, if you will,
mm,
the archetypal figure of the combat soldier. And you have
mm.
in there this whole discussion of, someone actually this, I mean, actually find these things sort of funny to read. There's a leveling of
They are funny to read.
testosterone. I mean, like, I mean, what part of the United States are they involved with to think that there's a leveling of male testosterone and you have this masculinity problem? But talk about the, just blatant misogyny. I mean, I don't like to throw that word around, but this stuff is absolutely nuts. And it's just, but it's part of what they're arguing about. And
Hmm. Hmm.
and then lets everybody go out and lift weights. I mean, I've lifted weights ever since I was a kid, so I sort of find this one amusing too. But like
Hmm.
just this whole, and then these podcasters, the Bronze. I mean, what's the guy, the Bronze Age guy?
Bronze Age pervert.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean that now we're getting into the kind of the nasty sort of underbelly, but yeah, it's sort of there's the
Well,
three groups on top, and then there's this whole cultural universe of also people with PhDs, by the way, right? When
yeah,
we're
right,
talking like
right.
Bronze Age pervert
Yeah.
is a Yale PhD who has studied, Nietzsche and Strauss and
Oh.
Pindar. So it's high, it's not just sort of
It
another
doesn't
Joe
matter what
Rogan
school
guy.
you go to, I must admit. Anyway, go
Oh
on.
no, I know, but but he trades on that prestige,
Oh,
right?
well,
And I
that's
think that
ridiculous. Yeah.
that's something that does matter because they all know how to use they know how this stuff plays in the American psyche,
Right.
And so if they get to say, "Oh yeah," and my
I went to
supervisor,
Yale, right? Yeah.
yeah, okay, well, oh, I didn't know that, but yeah, my supervisor was, Harvey Mansfield and Stephen Smith at Yale. Like you get to say that, and that has a kind of weight that that others don't get to have, and so that's why I included them in my book, and they were also, I think, gaining a lot of popularity through this whole era.
Right. Well, Harvey Mansfield, of course. So explain to the audience who Harvey Mansfield is. It's not exactly a moniker of great. To me, here's this guy. We're talking about Harvey Mansfield who opposed women's studies, right?
Yeah, he made
Yeah.
his mark by being the sole faculty vote, I
At
believe,
Harvard.
against the creation of the women's studies program. But I mean, the guy, he's a Straussian. He's written a lot of good books about, or interesting at least, books about, Machiavelli and so forth. But then he wrote this book in the early aughts called Manliness, as a sort of defense of gender stereotypes, effectively, and the kind of male thumos, this desire to, um, sort of spirited desire to conquer and so forth. So he wrote this defense of manliness. And he's friends with Michael Anton. I don't know. He's not a super important person in my book, but I think that you do have a weird configuration of young men who have PhDs in political philosophy or political science who have really taken their moment to of Trumpism and of this populist movement to become basically fascist propagandists for MAGA or just for the manosphere, and that are connected in some ways to the more serious sort of still in the ivory tower types that I write about.
Yeah, it's
And so I
interesting.
was trying in the book to
Yeah,
show these connections, right? It's kind of hard to
right.
quickly account for all of that.
No, it's a difficult process because trust me, when people like myself and others, we've been looking at this stuff for decades, and it's
Hmm.
hard to figure out. And if
Hmm.
I'm going to sit there and throw the F word, the fascism word, I want to be very precise about that because I know when
Yeah.
Trump was elected, everybody was going through they were treating into pluralistic political science and saying, oh, it's authoritarianism, and then forgetting the trends that we were seeing that interesting. They bear some relationship historically to what we saw in Italy and
Yeah.
Germany. But again, we're
Yeah.
not those countries. Now,
No, but the aesthetic is just absolutely unmistakable in some of these
oh,
cases.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is this how they're dealing with, the 1619 project. Now, look, I'm in my late 70s. So the 60s, to discover Black history was something that happened to me back when I was a teenager. So the whole idea of the 1619 project, I read a lot of the critiques about it. I said, well, okay, I've been sort of conscious about this stuff since 1962, 63. And
Hmm.
so it's not really nothing new, but what was clear that it drove them absolutely bananas, the
Hmm.
1619 project. The whole idea of talking about, and some of it we know was historically a little flawed. The idea of
Hmm.
talking about the question of what causes the revolution. And they were arguing,
Yeah, absolutely.
they were arguing it was sort of like a white settler Rhodesia type reaction, which I didn't agree with.
Yeah.
But that's not to ignore slavery. So, what do you make of all that? This way they basically freaked out, and went and
Hmm.
but it's a conscious intellectual and social response, a counterattack against let's obliterate any of these kind of discussions. And so look at what you're seeing today. People removing plaques in the Smithsonian, going to national parks. I mean, an erasure
Yeah.
of
Hmm.
history. And how do you see that interrelated to this whole ideas that you've been exploring with them?
Well, I mean, I think what I try to do when I'm writing about this stuff is to show how there's something here that's triggering them. A lot of it seems like messed up racism and just kind of a reactionary impulse, right? I think that's true. And you can see it now. I mean, they were so opposed to taking down the Confederate statues, and now they're taking down Black history. I mean, that's perverse, right? I mean, just the moral equivocation there, or like failure to even make that differentiation is bizarre. But what I also think is going on is they overreached, they overreacted, and they also, I think, they allow themselves to be persuaded that the 1619 project was an attempt to take over everything and to like replace the old curricula and stuff. But that wasn't true. It was always a supplement, right? And so it was a massive sort of window into just their basic thinking about this stuff and how hyper sort of reactive it is. I think what I tried to also convey though is that I think driving some of that was also some deeper problems with our educational institutions and some of the failures of our institutions of K through 12 education and also higher education to just sort of provide a rich, pluralistic and version of history that is also somewhat formative and positive and not just critical, like that there needs to be more than a critical voice or a jingoistic propaganda voice. What you need is like a real clash, and you need like different perspectives on the table, and you need to trust your citizens and your teachers to handle some of that. And it's going to be plural in different places of the country, because I think part of the problem is we have a nationalized culture that has no room for any kind of subtlety. It's, of course, across the country, educational programs are very, very different and divergent. So it's a very difficult, big problem to kind of to navigate, and they've failed completely, right? I mean, as you say, they're censoring things, they're imposing these um, pretty sort of dogmatic programs of patriotic education and so forth. But I think that was driven in part by a worry about sort of an overly critical approach not just to our racial history, but just to thinking in general, right? And a kind of breakdown of different styles of inquiry and education. And so that's something I think a lot about because I care about it a lot. And I think that in some instances, our universities, we really have failed to kind of provide a more robust liberal education and have been really short-sighted. And so they're really leveraging that vulnerability in powerful ways. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important to recognize, that not just the sort of CRT stuff and the higher ed stuff, but the movement as a whole. And this is true of fascism too, historically, right? It's really manipulating some of these vulnerabilities and these weaknesses, these cultural weaknesses of liberalism, which are not things we can just eradicate. We can't just eradicate the vulnerabilities of liberalism, but we need to be aware that they're there and
Absolutely.
that they are vulnerabilities.
Oh, absolutely. No, I covered the National History Standard debate in the early 90s, which was basically
Mm,
on the same issue. And
yeah,
I interviewed the people who were constructing it. And the problem I had with some of my interviews, I'm thinking of the late Gary Nash, who was a brilliant historian. But,
yeah,
the issue of how to deal with these kind of critiques that came up, because people said, well, you're not including Robert E. Lee. Well, Robert E. Lee, I do think should be included, but nevertheless, I think he should be critically looked at.
hmm,
They would raise issues like that, and then it was actually came out of Cheney's wife's overseeing of the National Endowment of the Humanities, but then it caused a huge furor. And I agree that the issue of how to handle down to the, I would say, preschool level issues,
yeah,
of social studies and history, and make American kids, no matter where they are, aware of the whole world.
yeah,
And how do you make them aware of China, Middle East, Latin America? How do you introduce curriculum that actually prepares the citizenry for the 21st century, which I do
yeah.
not see coming out from these guys. So let me bring other people
No,
in right now, and
okay.
I will, of course, jump back in. It's great, Laura. It's great. It's a lot of fun to talk to you.
Yeah,
Uh,
you too.
yeah, it's really fun, and although it's depressing to talk about,
Yeah, it's depressing, but
but
here we
anybody,
are.
Alex, you want to jump in with something? Just unmute. Yeah, go
Sure,
ahead.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, to piggyback off something said earlier, there's like the practical politics of all this, which is like the funding of these conservative thinkers. Of course, we
Hmm.
think back to like the Powell doctrine, but foundations like the John M. Olin Foundation, of course, the Koch network, and so on. That, and I
Hmm.
was trying to find. I have Jane Mayer's, of course, book on the Kochs
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
around
I mean, I
here.
think that whole
So I'm
world is,
just
yeah. Sorry, go on.
so my understanding from that is that kind of, that, and of also corporate funding in particular, that's kind of pushed conservatism in certain, directions that are basically useful, yeah, for corporations and their concept of like, yeah, unrestrained capitalism. And yeah, so I just wonder how you think that works practically
I mean, I
with
think it's
these intellectuals.
difficult. I mean, I just don't have the bandwidth to fully cover that like Jane Meyer might, right? I mean,
Oh, right.
but I think that the Kochs have been interesting. They haven't, my understanding again, without sort of going into all the weeds, is that they've resisted a lot of this. Um, and but I think the tech side of things is very interesting because I think they just at the end of the last Thiel is a very important figure in all of this, and the end of the last election cycle, they all kind of came on board, right? We saw this big flurry of activity with these tech billionaires and so forth. So I think that's pretty fickle. I don't think that all those guys are sort of totally sold on the MAGA new right, though Thiel certainly is a ringleader and so forth, and Musk obviously is sort of into it. But so yeah, I don't have a super. I think that there's been a kind of a reconfiguration of some of the economic world also, and I guess one other thing is that there's a big tension in the movement because a big part of their critique of the old establishment was a critique of of capitalism and of globalization, right? And uh, so that really cuts against that old donor class in the GOP, is my understanding, and so that's a source of some of these big tensions.
Right. Yeah. The other thing is, I recently, a few months ago, read Matt Dallek's book on, the persistent importance of, the Bircher movement, so, John
Mm,
Birch Society and
mm-hmm.
all of
Oh yeah,
that,
yeah,
and
yeah,
how
yeah.
that's kind of, that, and basically he goes against, yeah, the idea Jim talked about, from that Buckley, oh, he kept them out and they were
Right.
a minor part of conservatism. But
Yeah.
again, I think so. I just, yeah, wonder where that kind of through line is in your, and that, obviously,
Yeah.
anti-communism is
Yeah.
central to American conservatism. So, yeah,
Yeah, I mean that the anti-communism was what sort of brought a lot. That was a big part of the settlement where they all did come together for so long until the end of the Cold War. But I think, I mean, I tell a bit of that story and just sort of try to articulate the idea that it was never a clean sort of cordon or whatever
right,
that kept.
right,
It was always really, these boundaries were porous. And I try to, I just have to tell the story very briefly, right? Relying on some of that other work because I'm really trying to focus on the present. But the anti-Semitism has been s-
yeah,
such a reminder of how that's still there and powerful, that I think it does matter. Um, it just matters so much, and it's just a very persistent thing on the American
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah. So, Mike, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, I want to say one more thing though, quickly,
Oh,
which is
sure.
that some of these, maybe I said this already, but some of those guys who had been excluded from the movement, like Paul Gottfried is a good example here.
Tell us who he is.
He's a paleoconservative,
Oh, and
old.
tell us the difference between the paleo and
So,
neoconservative, the way you
so
look.
paleoconservative is the response to neoconservative, and it's basically like the version of the old right with a capital O and R, which is kind of nativist, semi-isolationist. Um, that that was part of the early part of the 20th century, and sort of was against the growth of any government, and sort of what stood for particularism, almost sort of some with some ties to Southern agrarianism. And so then you have the emergence of the new right, the old new right, which was the Reagan Buckley world, right, and fusionism. And then at the end of the Cold War, that started to break apart, that coalition, and you had, and then the main establishment morphed into neoconservatism, which we all know what that is, I think. And the paleos were a response in the 90s, referencing the old right to a more isolationist, particularist sort of, I mean, blood and soil might be putting it a bit too strongly, right? But a kind of a more nativist version of conservatism.
That's like Pat Buchanan.
Yeah, Pat Buchanan's the guy, and Sam Francis is another important one. And then Paul Gottfried is this scholar who fits into some of those circles, and he runs the H.L. Mencken conference I don't think I mentioned it, but that's the conference that Darren Beattie was the speaker at. That's this white nationalist conference, and it's organized by Paul Gottfried. And
In the name of
oh,
H.L. Mencken, amazing. Too much.
yeah, what was I? Oh, but Paul Gottfried was kind of, and Sam Francis and Peter Berkowitz and John Derbyshire, some of these figures on the American right. That's a kind of intellectualized white supremacy world.
Oh.
They were ousted from places like the National Review. When we talk about those boundaries that were put up, it's those guys who were excluded. And they were furious about it, right? They took it very personally. They really felt the repercussions of that. It really hurt their careers, right? And so I think it's too easy maybe to say that none of that mattered or that it wasn't a real effort on Buckley's part and so forth. I mean, I think we have to know, well, then why were these guys so angry? Because they really were, right? They wrote long books about it. They're still complaining about it. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind.
My mother, my Buckley tried to date my mom back in '48, so I sort of laugh at this because I remember that's when he was caught breaking into a Jewish cemetery and screwing up all the different gravestones. But anyway, so Buckley always amused me.
Wow, what a
Oh
story.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was a big '60s story. Michael, go on, Mike.
Yeah, I it seems to me, I just want to go on one tack here. It seems to me that a lot of this is being motivated by insecurity on the part of these, shall we say, the MAGA right, and particularly sexual insecurity, which of course we saw with Nazism also, and
Hmm.
anti-Semitism in general, and with racism, obviously, particularly in this country. Um, the other forms of racism. And I was wondering, I mean, of course, now I'm getting into this psychological thing about is this just a sickness or sick people just putting their sickness into more intellectual words or into.
Hmm.
But to what degree is this simply a matter of, insecurity, particularly sexual insecurity? I don't know. I mean, it seems like you've been alluding to that in some ways. Um, so it seemed.
Hmm.
Um, to what degree is this a motivating factor in this, far right stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you read the book, you'll see more evidence for your hypothesis. I'll put it like that. I think we need to shy away from sort of overdoing things that are a little too reductive, right? But with that said, you still have a whole, like, there's a lot that's going on here with the manosphere and the broader culture on the right that is clearly a response to a kind of the rise of women in the workplace and these new professional norms and all kinds of sorting through of the new sort of social demographics that we're faced with in our world. And there has been a dramatic change in our social mores. I gather, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to know that a lot of things have changed, right? I mean, when I think about um, how gay people were treated when I was in high school versus how I think it is in some liberal cities now. I mean, it's pretty different and dramatically so. And so there's a lot that needs to be worked out. And I think there's been a real failure to, in some instances, to really to contend with that, to take seriously some of the problems that have come about. And so while I completely agree with you, and I'm tempted to just jump on the bandwagon and say, yes, it's just sexual insecurity that's driving these guys, because there's plenty of evidence for that. There's also, I think, something where we have to be a little more careful and a little more generous, right, with some of the people, especially the young people who are drawn into this and the young men who are drawn into it, because I think a lot of it's pretty seductive, just like fascism was. And I mean, I can understand how that is. I think it's hard, at the end of the 20th century or like in our period now to like have any sympathy with Nazis. Of course, that's hard. But if you kind of are in it and thinking about the seductive qualities of some of these arguments and some of the aesthetic and some of the, just the being part of something, I think we have to be pretty careful, to not. I mean, there's place for ridicule, and then I think there are places to kind of to be more careful and generous.
Look, and just one other thing, one other point, because I do have to leave soon. But the idea of technological dehumanization, which, in other words, as things get more technological and or to use it simply, and stuff is more online, people aren't dealing with each other as people,
Hmm.
has added to it. Now, we've always had racism,
Yeah.
very racism, so that doesn't explain that. But the fact is that the idea that it's the value of human life has become
Mm.
less worthwhile. Has that been feeding into their movement?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it has been, and it seems like like I hadn't quite thought of it in exactly those terms, but I think when we see, I mean, I've been writing a little bit lately, in a piece that I hope will come out soon, about some of these accounts, the social media accounts that the Homeland Security account and the Department of Labor, and they've just had some really like vicious and ugly social media. And I think what you're describing is that there's a kind of dehumanization and that's happening through our technology and through our modes of communication that obviously is also just kind of spilling out into the streets. So I'm just not an expert on that stuff. So I would love to know who people would recommend to read, right, about to really kind of articulate that more with more subtlety. But it's
Yeah,
got to be an important thing here.
yeah. Thank you, Michael, because that whole question of AI starts to come into this picture in all sorts of weird ways. Now, you to share your insights into this whole Christian nationalism phenomena, which is, I mean, there's many strains going into this process.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
how do you see that part of that?
So there's sort of different flavors of Christian nationalism, and I've got a chapter at the end of my book that tries to sort of draw these threads together and bring it all through, because the different factions I write about, there's obviously the Catholic faction, right? And there's a lot of these intellectuals, even from different not the post-liberal camp, that are also Catholic. Um,
This,
But there's
this is how
also
Patrick Deneen fits in.
Patrick Deneen, yes, and
And tell
Adrian
us who
Vermeule,
he
who
is.
we've talked about. I mean, so Patrick Deneen is a major post-liberal figure who wrote this book, Why Liberalism Failed. And 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 I think that honestly, the Catholic stuff is they're the ones who want to reorder the state towards this sort of spiritual common good and the Catholic social teaching, and JD Vance sort of fits in there. But there's other versions of it that are more concerned with the Christian character of the American founding, right? Who are less arguing about the
Hmm.
um about how to sort of reorient the state, and more interested in just sort of in a restoration of the original Christian state that they, and so they've got all these arguments about the Christian founding, some of which are sort of more persuasive than I maybe originally would have expected, but are basically saying, this was a Christian country, this should be a Christian country again, and so let's turn things around. And that's pretty pervasive on the right, no matter who you're talking about. And then there's also, I think, what I think is it's less about the intellectuals, but is really important to MAGA, is something called the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a Pentecost, sort of this independent charismatic Pentecostalism movement, like a revivalist movement that's also been happening over the last 10 years or so, and that Trump is quite well connected to, and for various other complicated reasons. This group of non-denominational charismatics have also gained a lot of power through the Trump administration, and have been an important part of MAGA's growth. So it's pretty complicated, all of the Christian nationalism stuff, but it's a unifying. I think it's sort of just the idea of a Christian state, and the idea that we should have more religion in public life and allow the Christian faith to be dominant in American society. That there are very few people I can think of who are part of the new right who would disagree with that.
Interesting. Now, tell us how you look on someone like Stephen Miller. Like, he was somebody who was close to David Horowitz. David Horowitz was a
Mm-hmm.
disillusioned member of the left, had been the editor of Ramparts magazine, has a whole storied history, set up a think tank down there in Southern California. But Miller, what I find interesting of Miller is Miller actually associated with Richard Spencer at Duke University, and
Hmm.
I knew somebody who was a faculty member there during that whole lacrosse crazy
Yeah.
that happened down there, where Miller got it right. I mean, those guys were unfairly blamed for it. There's no doubt about it. But
Yeah.
explain how you understand him intellectually, because he, of course, becomes the big boogeyman in this situation, the brilliant
Yeah.
Machiavel behind everything,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, and I mean, he does seem to be the one who's the closest to Trump, who's had the most staying power. And sort of, I use him as part of this one chapter called the From Alt-Right to Hard Right, where I'm just going through this roster of different people who have been sort of in or close to the administration, who are some of these fascist types. And Stephen Miller is not, he's very careful. He doesn't, and he's a kind of political actor, so he's kind of cagey and doesn't have a huge written record. There's a great piece by Greg Sargent about him and some of his intellectual influences. I think
Really?
Schmidt is one. Yeah, Greg Sargent, who he now writes for the New Republic. I can send you the link.
Please,
So
please.
he's done the most sort of in-depth work on Stephen Miller, but yeah, he's got this story where he started at Duke, and I think just the nativism runs pretty deep there, and he is, I would count him among the sort of ideologues and fanatics. I haven't been able to kind of fully access, except for through the Sargent article, what exactly he's about.
Yeah, it's interesting, the illiberalism. Now, who's in the illiberalism project there with you at GW? Because what's interesting about your book, it's very much a in the weeds look at the intellectual ideas of all these different strands we're seeing.
Hmm.
What I would find interesting is to get that juxtaposed, like, because I was going to sit there, maybe we could do this another time. I was looking at studies of the Trump voter, and
Yeah,
so to say,
that's
okay,
different.
so let's look at that in 2016, and let's look at that in 2024, and how does that jive? I mean, we don't necessarily have to do this today, but perhaps another time.
Yeah, yeah.
But how's this jive with what you're saying intellectually about these guys? Um, and it would seem, and it's too bad Alan Brinkley's passed because he would enjoy this tremendously. He was very much. I'd always tease him when I'd see him because he was right, of course. And since he wrote that article in American Historical Review in 1994, I mean, I'm not saying there was a lot of scholars have done work about this. So there's a
Mm.
lot of work out there about conservatism. I had a friend of mine, her mother was a big Phyllis Schlafly fan. And so I'm stuck in Thanksgiving in Staten Island maybe 25 years ago. And then she's like going into the basement, pulling out all this old Phyllis Schlafly stuff from 1950s, which to me
Mm-hmm.
was like, I said, whoa, I didn't know that. I had to be polite and, you see, but I was curious. But,
Mm-hmm.
there's all these, and the nativism you bring up is a whole other strand to
Yeah. Yeah.
think and talk about. And but anyway, Alex, we'll just get to Alex and then we'll sort of close out. Go on, Alex.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. You know, one other kind of term that these guys like to throw it around is, of course, cultural Marxism, which
Yeah.
they, which of course they misunderstand. I mean, and again, their obsession with the Frankfurt School and how, and of course, mostly it's, their overweening belief in the influence of Marxism, and of course their
Mm-hmm.
unwillingness to acknowledge that the whole term is basically one invented by the Nazis with all of that baggage.
Mm-hmm.
And Emma's
Mm-hmm.
looking like up online, like Ted Cruz. He's got a book with cultural Marxism in the title, and of course
Mm-hmm.
again there's all these, they're intellectuals. But yeah, I just wonder, yeah, what your understanding of what they think is cultural Marxism, and yeah, why this, the obsession with the Frankfurt School, which again, I was sort of kind of like marginal in, in even Marxists, studies for lack of a better word. So yeah, well, why do
Yeah, I
they,
mean, in some ways,
why
I
do they
don't know that I have
fixate
a
on that,
super refined answer here, except for that the Marxism is such a well-primed, sort of immediate reference point for the American public that I think it's
Right.
useful to them, and so they just run with it. But I mean, they under it's an obsession with hierarchy and an obsession with this idea of equality and equal results and outcomes that
Right.
they just anytime they see anything that smacks of that or systemic thinking, right, that denies any kind of individual agency. I think that they get their heckles up. Is that the phrase? And
Yeah.
so, but I mean, Yoram Hazony had a ridiculous article a few years ago about how liberalism just naturally has all of the same ends and
Right.
is just Marxism in disguise. Which I mean,
Yeah.
ask any American
Yeah.
Marxist, and they're going to have some things to say about
Yeah.
that, right? So it's sort of bizarre, but I think one thing important to keep in mind here is that some of these guys, they really are radicalized in a way that far exceeds the average voter, in my view. I mean, I have seen some empirical evidence for this claim. George Hawley is a scholar I respect who's done some empirical work on this, but I think there's a lot of empirical work that says, the American voter might be radicalized in one or two dimensions, but it, as a whole is not at all really
No.
like
Yeah.
the people I'm writing about, including MAGA voters. There's a lot of complexity here. There's a
Right.
lot of sort of apathy and political disillusionment. And so I mean, for me, that's even a sign of hopefulness at this point. So I
Hmm.
think it's kind of complicated and important to keep
Well,
that in mind.
we've seen that in the past couple of weeks with the shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just Laura, just curious again, where do you think that portends for the upcoming midterms if you want to, make any
I
comment?
mean, if I want to just I mean, I don't want to, but I am hopeful about the midterms. But again, they continue to surprise me. A lot can happen, right?
Hmm.
So, but I think
Well,
I think they're in a very difficult spot.
Joan, you wanted to say something, Joan? You had been unmuted. Well, just unmute Joan. I'll stop. Well, that's why I began with like the issue of raiding Fulton County, deciding to
Hmm.
nationalize the election.
Yeah.
This is just who knows how we're going to react to something like this. And I guess
Yeah.
just to go out is the issue of the universities. I mean, I will be present at a discussion tomorrow at Columbia University where, once again, people that whole extortive agreement with Trump is something that is highly unpopular, as you can well
Yeah.
imagine, among many
Yeah.
faculty and students. And yet, members of the board of trustees will say, "Well, what was our choice? What would you do if you were in a situation like that?" Which is always interesting to think about. But now you have a situation where the compromise is even more stark with this ICE rampage going on. And I'm just wondering how you see the attacks. You got this argument about the attacks on the university is to discredit objective information. the whole idea of critical social theory. And sure, I know lots of people who are into critical theory. Big deal. There's lots of
Mhm,
people who aren't into critical theory. And it's
mhm.
like it's not the academy's one big there's a seething cesspool of the Frankfurt School born
No,
into something new.
no,
So
but I would, yeah. I
you
mean,
know
I
you know
think
what I
that,
mean. Go on.
yeah. I guess I have very little sympathy for obviously like the these settlements that they've made with the Trump administration, I guess. But but I guess they're in a hard spot too. But I mean, ultimately, I think these institutions have really failed to defend themselves with any rigor, and it's pathetic, and they don't know how to talk about this stuff, and they don't know how to defend their principles and stand up to these illiberal actions on the part of these governments and just stand for something, right? And take some risks to articulate what they stand for, how they won't be bullied around, how they want to protect, and how there's room at the universities for all kinds of different types of study, and they should stand up for all of that, right? And be able to describe what it is they're actually doing. And I haven't seen much of that. I mean, there are some examples of people who have done well, but it's pretty bad.
No, I agree. Now, what are you working on next? Are you going to take this project and do something different
I'm
with it?
not sure. I'm sort of still trying to keep track of my inbox. It's been pretty wild,
I
and
can imagine.
so that's fun. But I think I'd like to work on higher education and on some of the things we just touched on. The vulnerabilities of liberalism and how to do better at defending it.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really interesting project, and we look forward, Laura, to sharing ideas with you in the future. It was a great pleasure to talk with you today.
You too. What a pleasure. Thank you.
No, no, it was really a lot of fun because I read when they sent me the galley, I said, "Oh, holy cow, what a great, insightful book." And I've been mentioning it to my friends of mine, saying, "Hey, you got to like use this as for teaching devices because it's a really good jump off point." I mean, I don't, I the only thing the historical stuff I would probably have a different approach with, but I said this is a
Yeah.
great way to start it off a discussion. Great way.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's great to hear. And let's keep talking.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, Laura.
Okay. Yeah. Have a good day. Talk to
Have
you
a good
later.
day. Bye bye.
Okay. Bye.